YouTube, Sidekick here with another Microsoft Flight Simulator video. This time it's a review of the FlightSimWare Grumman Widgeon. This is a paid module for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. It's been out for a while, but I wanted to review it because I had earlier done a review of the free downloadable content Grumman Goose, and I thought it would be good to sort of compare them side by side a little. As I said, the Widgeon is available on the Microsoft Marketplace for around $30, I think. It is effectively the smaller sibling of the Grumman Goose. It's an amphibian, meaning that it can land and take off on either land or water. The design dates from the early 1940s. So, like the Goose, the Widgeon represents kind of the golden age of piston-engined aircraft, and also, to some extent, the golden age of seaplanes, although kind of in miniature. I bought the Widgeon after trying the Goose because the Goose convinced me that I wanted to spend more time flying seaplanes in Flight Simulator, but there were a few rough edges on the Goose that I hoped would be better in the Widgeon as a paid product. It's lived up to my expectations, mostly. So let's jump in the cockpit and have a look. When you first jump into the cockpit, the Widgeon certainly does a good job of taking you back to the golden age of handmade airplanes. So the texturing inside the cockpit is definitely good. Probably one of the best things about the model. It definitely gives you the feeling of sitting inside a 1940s aircraft, and maybe one that's been around, well, for almost that long. Lots of good little wear details on the cockpit, a little bit of wood on the end of the knobs on the end of the levers. In general, it really gives you the feeling of being in a vintage aircraft, and I really like that. The only thing I would say is I would like to have a word with whoever chose the color of green for the upholstery. Like, seriously? The model does come with a clipboard that lets you set a few options. These are mostly having to do with the cosmetic visual effects that you get when you're parked and powered down. The one operational option that can be set is the use of realistic hydraulics, which is interesting and adds some period authenticity to the operation of the gear and the flaps, but it does require you to unbind any controller options that you have set for flaps and gear, so I've chosen to go with it disabled, at least for now. The one benefit of the Widgeon over the Goose is that the Widgeon does have a checklist that is fully integrated into the game, so we don't have to guess our way through the startup procedure. So let's get fired up. All right, let's open the checklist here. Now, you will notice that the checklist is already showing a bunch of stuff complete. That's because I've already been taxiing around in the aircraft before I shut it down here on the runway. So we'll just go through it anyways. First of all, we're going to set the parking brake. Check the fuel quantities. That's the bottom two gauges in the middle there. And we have fuel. I'm just going to need to get the control stick back. I like this system of having that little button that you click to make it go and come. And it's free. And we'll check the power level, the power levers up there. You can tilt up and you can see them a little bit more. And we'll just make sure they're pulled fully back. So before starting the engines, we are going to want to make sure the avionics switch is off. We're going to have to make the yoke go away here again. And it's off. And then we're going to want to turn the battery switch next to it on, which we have done. Just make sure that we have nav lights. Can't see them because of the switches, but that's the nav lights. And those are the two generator switches right there and there. Now the fuel crossfeed is back here. So we do need to make sure that's on. Fuel should be rich. So I can put it down, but I have it bound to a control here. So let me do that again to make sure it stays rich. Okay. Okay, now mixture lever is rich. Trim tabs. So we got to look up for those. They're up there. Trim tabs, there's nose. And over to the right is the rudder. And we want to unlock the tail wheel. Time to start the right engine. Turn the beacon light on. Get the right fuel pump on. Now we have to get the mag switch all the way forward. That's both for the right engine. And then we press the starter after we check, make sure everything's clear. And the right engine is going. Once we make sure that it's started, we turn the fuel pump off, check the oil pressure, maybe advance the throttle here just a little bit. And pull it back just a little bit. All right. Right engine successfully going. So, let's get the left engine started. Turn the left fuel pump on. Don't need to prime the engine. Get that magneto switch on. Now that magneto switch is pointing to the left when it's set to both. And crank the engine. And it catches as well. Once again, turn the fuel pump off. And check the oil pressure. It's registering. And maybe push the throttle forward just a little bit. Alright, and our engines are started. And, oops, that's not the taxi lights. Taxi lights are there. Taxi lights on. Okay, before takeoff, check the engine gauges. Yes, we have engine gauges. Yes, check. Magnetos are in the right position. Yes. And now we want to turn the fuel pumps on. Just making sure we're exercising the props here. Seem to be working. We'll turn the fuel pumps on. And finally, we'll turn the avionics switch on so we get our GPS and our radios up. And then we want to turn the landing light on, and that is the switch farthest to the left there. And we are ready to go. Okay, so parking brake off and tail wheel unlocked, which I didn't show, but taxiing forward now. Ground handling of the Widgeon is about what you'd expect for a tail dragger. Not a particularly agile tail dragger. I would recommend programming your engines each to a different axis if you can, to allow you to have differential power as well as differential braking and rudder. It's not essential on land, but on the water it's pretty important. So I think you're going to want to set that up if you can. In terms of braking on the ground, you need to be aware that the Widgeon is pretty nose heavy, so you got to be a little light on the brakes even when you're going pretty slowly to keep the nose from dropping precipitously. All right, here we are in a good takeoff position, just doing some final checks. And now we're putting down the flaps. I can't see them out the window, but there you can see the flap lever's down to 15 degrees now. It goes down in 5-degree increments, which is pretty nice. And I think we're ready to go. So let's advance the throttle with the brakes on here a little. And let's let go of the brakes. And away we go. Behaves pretty nicely. The nose comes down. It's like any tail dragger. I'm still getting used to it, so I'm not keeping it exactly as straight as I'd like to. We come off the ground around 70 miles an hour, and we pull up the gear. Gear light's down below that. Pull up the gear, it's blue. And then we can start raising the flaps. And we're climbing out a little bit more than 80 miles an hour. Pull up a little bit more, climb out a little bit faster. So, as I said before, the cockpit is very redolent of the classic age of aviation. We have a standard steam gauge layout with airspeed indicator, artificial horizon, and altimeter in the top row from left to right, and the turn and bank indicator and the gyro and the vertical speed indicator in the second row from left to right, with the engine instruments on the center of the console above the GPS. Like a lot of high-wing multi-engine aircraft, a lot of the controls and switches are actually on the cockpit roof. The flap and gear system is faithfully modeled and quite different than the modern flip switch implementations that you'll find in most aircraft today. I also particularly like the trim lever, particularly the indicator scale, which, unlike a lot of aircraft in Flight Simulator, is easy to read and also easy to adjust in small increments. I think the Widgeon may be the easiest aircraft to trim in Flight Simulator that I have come across. All of which makes the Widgeon pretty easy and relaxing to fly. And once you get climbed out, It's pretty easy to pull the power back, get the trim dialed in, and sit back and enjoy the ride, even without an autopilot. Sound in the cockpit is good. I like the feeling of power of the twin engines overhead. It's not the throaty roar of the Goose's radials, but it's still pretty good. So, some quick facts about the Widgeon. As I said, it was designed for the civilian market in about 1940. With the advent of World War II, though, it actually saw some extensive service with the U.S. Navy and Coast Guard, and also with the Royal Navy, where it was known as the Gosling, obviously because it looked like a smaller version of the Goose. Approximately 300 Widgeons of various models were produced, but the last one was delivered in 1949. Over the years, a number of Widgeons have been modernized and fitted with upgraded engines, and I think the version that's represented in the game is still the original design, albeit with modern radios and a Garmin GPS navigation unit. So now you've had a chance to see some of the external views of the model, and I think you can agree that the external model is very nice. The detail is really there with the lines of rivets and the texturing. There are lots of great liveries available, including this Royal Air Force one that we've been looking at, but there are also ones for the U.S. Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy. As far as the external sound model goes, the engines again sound, I think, about right for large piston engines of the time. Not quite as sexy as the radial engines, but I think they sound appropriate. As far as the other custom sounds that are in the model, the most obvious ones are the ones for the hydraulics, for raising the gear and raising and lowering the flaps, and they sound interesting, and they sound appropriate at least. As far as the other sound modeling in terms of switch throws and various sounds in the air, it's pretty decent. I wouldn't say that it was exceptional, but it certainly is immersive enough to make you feel like you're flying in the aircraft. As far as the flight model goes, I think that I would rate it much the same way. Good, but not really exceptional. The aircraft handles the way you'd expect a reasonably heavy twin-engined aircraft to handle, a bit like a one-ton truck. The overall feeling is good, but there aren't any details that make it stand out. Overall, it feels a little, I don't know, optimistic, maybe. It just feels a little bit too slick in the air. It speeds up more quickly and slows down more slowly than I would expect for such a high-drag aircraft. For instance, you can cruise at 160 miles an hour with the engine set at only about 1,800 revolutions, which seems, I don't know, a little bit too easy for me. As far as landing goes, it's pretty straightforward, especially on the water. Once you've slowed down to around 100 knots, it's time to put the big barn door flaps down, slowly. And after a bit of pitch up, the speed and the nose will drop into a nice landing configuration with good visibility over the nose. The landing speed is well controlled by trim, maybe a bit too well. Again, it just feels a little bit just too easy. And the power is very responsive, and so it really is pretty easy to put your landing spot right where you want it. When coming in for a water landing, I like to actually start out with a fairly high descent rate, and then the Widgeon just lets me flatten it out slowly as I get closer to the water, and the control is fine enough that I can basically fly 10 feet off the water and touch down only when I want to. Once on the water handling is actually, it's not bad, which is a big difference between the paid Widgeon and the free Goose, and maybe the best reason of all to pick up the Widgeon. The key to water handling is differential thrust. So again, you're going to want to program each engine to a different axis if you can. With a combination of opposite rudder and engine, it is possible to move the Widgeon around pretty smartly on the water without having to build up too much speed. Like I said, this is the one drawback of the Goose that I have really not been able to overcome, and which in the end pretty seriously compromises my ability to really enjoy that model. You just can't taxi it around. It's good for going from place to place, but once you've landed, it's pretty hard to get yourself maneuvered to take off again. With the Widgeon, though, taxi and takeoff from the water are pretty straightforward. So, my overall impressions of the Widgeon. I like the plane, and I'm glad that I bought it. It's not perfect. And I think it might not be great value at a higher price point, but at $30, it's pretty decent. For me, much of the value comes from filling a niche that isn't well filled by all of the single-engine float planes and amphibians in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Because the Widgeon's speed at over 150 knots when it cruises, and kind of the roomier feeling of the cabin and the ease with which you can trim it out, it's a better choice in which to do things like coastal sort of sightseeing and island hopping than a lot of the float planes that cruise around at 100 or 110 knots. That's the main reason I bought the Widgeon, and the main reason I keep flying it. If I want to fly in and around water and cover any significant ground to do it, in the wood paneling style of the classic age of aviation, then the Widgeon is the way to go, for me. And that's going to do it for this video. For now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.